Luke Whitmore did not lower his voice. He stood beside his grieving wife, Natalie Whitmore, as she faced her mother's coffin, then told her plainly that he was done pretending. Not later, not in private. Here, in a cathedral filled with witnesses. He walked away before the final prayer. No apology, no hesitation. Only silence left behind him, thick, judging, unforgettable. What no one in that room knew was that Natalie had just become the sole heir to a $50 billion trust. And Luke had just walked away from it. If you believe dignity doesn't need to be loud to be powerful, stay with this story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if stories about quiet strength and justice matter to you, consider subscribing. Natalie Whitmore had learned over the years how to exist without interrupting a room. Not by shrinking, but by refining. She spoke when necessary. She listened always. And more often than not, she remembered things others forgot. Tone timing omission. The way a sentence could reveal more in what it avoided than what it said. It was a habit her mother had taught her. Eleanor Whitmore never raised her voice. She never needed to. In private, Eleanor would sit across from Natalie at the long walnut table in their Upper East Side townhouse. A legal pad in front of her, a fountain pen balanced precisely between her fingers. She believed in writing things down, not because she might forget, but because clarity demanded structure. Emotion clouds memory, Eleanor once told her, without looking up from her notes. But facts stay where you put them. Natalie had been 19 when she first heard that, old enough to understand it, young enough to think she never would need it. She had been wrong. Now, at 34, standing in the quiet aftermath of her mother's funeral, Natalie found herself returning to that discipline, not consciously at first, but instinctively. Every word Luke had spoken in the church, replayed in her mind, not blurred by grief, but sharpened by it. He had not hesitated. That was what stayed with her. Not the content, not even the cruelty, the certainty. Luke Whitmore had always been certain. He entered rooms like they already belonged to him. He shook hands like agreements were foregone conclusions. He smiled, not to connect, but to confirm. When they first met, it had felt like stability. Luke was an investment strategist at a mid-sized Manhattan firm, ambitious, disciplined, visibly on the rise. He spoke in projections and outcomes, in calculated risks and controlled exposure. Natalie, who had spent her early career working with small arts foundations and nonprofit grant programs, found his world foreign, but strangely reassuring. He had plans, and plans at the time felt like safety. Their courtship had been efficient. Thoughtful dinners, measured conversations, a rhythm that suggested compatibility rather than passion, but Natalie had never required spectacle. Luke admired her composure. He said so often. "You're not like other people," he told her once, over dinner at a quiet restaurant in Tribeca. "You don't overreact. You think." At the time, she had taken it as a compliment. Over the years, she began to understand it differently, because what Luke admired, he also relied on. Natalie did not argue when he suggested consolidating their finances for efficiency. She did not question when he took the lead on investments on accounts on long-term planning. "It's just easier this way," he would say, already moving on. And she allowed it, not out of ignorance, but out of trust. Or perhaps, more precisely, out of the assumption that trust did not require constant verification. Their marriage from the outside appeared seamless. They hosted selectively, attended the right events, maintained a home that reflected quiet affluence without ostentation. Luke's colleagues respected him. Their wives found Natalie pleasant, if somewhat distant. No one ever described her as difficult. That too had its advantages. Eleanor, however, had never been entirely convinced. She never interfered. She never criticized Luke directly, but she observed him the way she observed everything, without announcement. Once after a dinner where Luke had spent a considerable amount of time discussing market strategies Natalie had not been involved in, Eleanor poured herself a glass of water and said almost casually, "Control is most effective when it feels like structure." Natalie had looked at her, then uncertain. Eleanor met her gaze briefly, then added, "Just make sure you always know the difference." That conversation had ended there. It was Eleanor's way. She planted thoughts, not instructions. And Natalie, for a long time, chose not to examine them too closely, until patterns began to repeat. Small things at first, decisions made without her, accounts she didn't fully access, explanations that were technically sufficient, but never complete. If she asked, Luke would answer, but always with a tone that suggested the question itself had been unnecessary. "You don't need to worry about that," he would say. And eventually she stopped asking, not because she agreed, but because she understood the cost of insisting. It was not conflict Luke avoided, it was inconvenience. And Natalie had no interest in becoming one. Still, she paid attention, always. The morning after the funeral, the house felt larger than it had the day before. Not emptier, just more defined. Luke had not come home that night. There had been no message, no explanation. Natalie moved through the kitchen slowly, her movements deliberate, almost methodical. She made coffee the way she always did, measured, precise. 2 cups, then paused. She looked at the second cup for a moment before setting it aside. Cold, untouched. She didn't throw it away. Not yet. Instead, she carried her own cup into the living room and sat by the window. Manhattan moved outside, as it always did, uninterrupted, indifferent. Her phone rested on the table beside her. No calls. 1 unread email. She had seen it the night before, but chosen not to open it. The sender, Michael Davenport. Subject line, request for private meeting. Eleanor's attorney. Natalie reached for the phone not with urgency, but with intention. She opened the email. The message was brief, professional, no excess language. A request to meet within 48 hours regarding matters related to Eleanor Whitmore's estate. No details, no indications, just a time, a location, and a note emphasizing confidentiality. Natalie read it once. Then again. She did not react outwardly. No visible shift in expression, no sudden realization. But something aligned. Not new information, just confirmation that something had already been set in motion long before this moment. Eleanor had never left things unresolved. Natalie placed the phone back on the table and reached for a notebook. It was not the same kind her mother used, simpler, unlined, less formal. But the purpose was the same. She opened to the first page. For a moment, she sat without writing. Then in small, controlled handwriting, she began. Luke left at 11:42 a.m. A pause. Statement. I'm not doing this anymore. Another pause. No return. No contact. She stopped there. Not because there was nothing more to add, but because she understood something her mother had always known. You don't need everything at once. You just need to start with what is true. Outside, the city continued without her. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Natalie did not feel the need to keep pace with it. She simply observed and waited. Grief, in Natalie Whitmore's experience, did not arrive all at once. It moved in measured intervals, quiet, controlled, almost deliberate. It allowed her to function, to stand, to speak when required. And then without warning, it would settle behind her ribs, pressing inward, not enough to break her, but enough to remind her that something permanent had shifted. The days leading up to Eleanor Whitmore's funeral had unfolded with that same restrained intensity. There had been no chaos, no outward collapse, only structure. Natalie handled the arrangements herself, not because she had to, but because she had trusted no one else to do it with the precision her mother would have expected. Every detail was considered. The selection of the cathedral, the order of service, the guest list curated, not expanded. Eleanor had never believed in excess attendance. Presence is not the same as respect, she used to say. Natalie honored that. Luke, however, did not share her priorities. He was present technically. He attended meetings when required, stood beside her when others were watching, and nodded through conversations he did not initiate. But his attention was elsewhere. Always. On the second day after Eleanor's passing, Natalie found him in his home office speaking in low tones with someone she couldn't see. The door had been partially closed, not enough to suggest secrecy, but not open enough to invite interruption. She hadn't meant to listen, but she had paused. "No, the timing's not ideal," Luke was saying. His voice was measured but tight. "I understand that. I'll manage it." A pause. "No, she doesn't need to be involved." Another pause. "I said I'll handle it." Natalie stepped away before he could notice her, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The conversation was not meant for her. And more importantly, it was structured that way, deliberately. That night at dinner, Luke behaved as though nothing had occurred. He asked if the catering for the reception had been finalized, commented on the number of confirmations from attendees, mentioned almost in passing that he might need to step out briefly on the day of the funeral due to something work-related. Natalie listened. She responded where necessary. She did not reference what she had heard. Instead, she observed the pattern. Again, it wasn't new. Luke had always compartmentalized his life with precision. Work remained separate. Financial decisions were streamlined. Information was distributed on a need-to-know basis, and Natalie increasingly was placed outside that threshold. If she questioned it, he had answers, but never explanations. There was a difference, and Natalie had begun slowly to understand it. The morning before the funeral, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She answered anyway. "Miss Whitmore," the voice said, calm and professional. "This is Michael Davenport. I'm sorry to contact you under these circumstances." Natalie stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind her. "Yes," she replied. "I worked closely with your mother," he continued. "There are matters related to her estate that require your attention. I would prefer to discuss them with you in person at your convenience, though I would recommend within the next few days." His tone was deliberate, not urgent, but precise. Natalie leaned lightly against the wall, her fingers resting against the edge of a small table beside her. "After the funeral," she said. "Of course," Michael replied. "I'll have my office coordinate a time. And Miss Whitmore?" A brief pause. "Yes, this conversation should remain confidential for now." There was no emphasis in his voice, no implication, just a statement. Natalie understood it anyway. "I understand," she said. When the call ended, she stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not processing, not reacting, simply placing it. Another piece, another layer. Eleanor had always believed in timing. Things were revealed when they needed to be, not before. Natalie had once found that frustrating. Now, she found it instructive. The day of the funeral arrived without ceremony. No sudden realization, no emotional crescendo, just movement. Natalie dressed in black as expected. Simple, structured, no unnecessary detail. Her reflection in the mirror did not surprise her. She looked composed. She always did. Luke, by contrast, adjusted his tie twice before they left. "Big turnout," he remarked, glancing at his phone as they stepped into the car. Natalie said nothing. Traffic moved steadily through Manhattan, the city indifferent to the significance of the day. Buildings passed. Pedestrians crossed. Life continued. Luke checked his watch. After this, he said, not looking at her, "I may need to stop by the office for a bit." Natalie turned her gaze toward the window. "Of course. You mentioned that," she replied quietly. "I won't be long," he added. She didn't respond, because the duration was not the point. The choice was. At the cathedral, everything unfolded as planned. Guests arrived in measured intervals. Conversations were subdued. The air carried that particular stillness reserved for spaces where decorum replaced emotion. Natalie greeted people as they approached. She accepted condolences with a slight nod, a quiet thank you, nothing more. She did not linger in conversation. She did not invite it. Luke stood beside her for most of it, but not with her. His presence was physical, not emotional. He checked his phone more than once. responded to messages discreetly, shifted his weight as though waiting for something to conclude. Natalie noticed. She always did. The service itself was brief, intentional. Eleanor had left instructions. No extended eulogies, no performative grief, just acknowledgement. As the final prayer approached, Natalie stood at the front, her hands folded lightly in front of her. The room was quiet, still. Then Luke leaned slightly toward her. His voice was low, but not enough. "I'm not doing this anymore," he said. No context, no explanation. Just a conclusion delivered as fact. Natalie did not turn to look at him, not immediately. But she heard the shift in the room. Subtle, almost imperceptible. Attention redirected, not openly but collectively. Luke straightened, adjusted his jacket, and stepped back. Then he walked, down the aisle, past rows of seated witnesses, out the doors. He did not look back. Natalie remained where she was, unmoving, not because she was frozen, but because she chose to be. The priest continued. The service concluded. And when it did, Natalie turned slightly, acknowledging the space Luke had occupied just moments before. Empty. She noted the time. 11:42 a.m. She did not write it down then, but she would. Because this too was a fact. And facts, as her mother had taught her, were where everything began. The silence after Luke Whitmore walked out did not shatter the room. It settled. Like dust, disturbed but unwilling to rise too far. Those who had witnessed it did not speak, not immediately. They shifted in their seats, adjusted their posture, lowered their eyes. A few exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried more meaning than words, but would never be acknowledged aloud. This was not a place for confrontation. It was a place for restraint. And Natalie Whitmore understood that better than anyone in the room. She did not turn to follow Luke. She did not attempt to correct the moment. She remained where she was standing beside her mother's coffin, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. Only those who knew how to look would have noticed the slight tightening of her fingers, the near-invisible shift in her breath. The priest, to his credit, did not pause for long. He continued the final prayer as though nothing had happened. His voice remained steady, practiced, anchored in ritual rather than reaction. It gave the room something to hold on to, a structure to replace the disruption. Natalie listened, not to the words themselves, but to the cadence. Because cadence meant continuity. And continuity in moments like this was a form of protection. When the service concluded, guests rose slowly. There was no rush to leave. No immediate gathering. Instead, people approached Natalie one by one, as they had before, offering condolences that were now layered with something unspoken. Sympathy, yes, but also curiosity, and beneath that, judgment. Not directed at her, at least not overtly, but present nonetheless. Natalie accepted each interaction with the same quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate it." Simple, contained, final. She did not elaborate. She did not explain, because there was nothing to explain that would not diminish the dignity she had maintained. Across the room near the back pews, Michael Davenport stood with his hands lightly clasped in front of him. He had not approached her yet. He had observed, carefully, as he always did. Michael was not a man who inserted himself into moments unnecessarily. His profession required patience, the ability to wait until the correct time presented itself, rather than forcing relevance where it did not belong. He had worked with Eleanor Whitmore for over 2 decades. He understood her preferences, and increasingly he was beginning to understand her daughter. Natalie, he noted, had not faltered, not visibly. That mattered. Because Eleanor had not left her estate to someone who might react impulsively. She had left it to someone who could endure. And endurance, Michael knew, was far more valuable than force. When the last of the formal condolences had been offered, Natalie stepped away from the front of the cathedral. Not abruptly, not with urgency, but with quiet intention. She moved toward a side corridor, away from the center of attention, where the air felt slightly cooler, less weighted by observation. Only then did she allow herself a moment to pause. She did not lean against the wall. She did not close her eyes. She simply stood, alone, for the first time that day. The absence of Luke's presence, so recent, so deliberate, did not echo the way one might expect. There was no immediate surge of anger, no sharp edge of humiliation. Instead, there was clarity, not complete, but forming. Because Luke had not made a mistake. He had made a decision, and decisions, unlike accidents, revealed intent. Natalie reached into her coat pocket and retrieved her phone. The screen remained dark. No messages, no missed calls. She noted that, not with disappointment, but with confirmation. He had not left in haste. He had left with purpose. Somewhere beyond the main hall, the sound of quiet conversation resumed. Guests were beginning to disperse, their voices low, controlled, already shaping the narrative that would travel beyond these walls. Natalie knew how that worked. Stories did not spread because they were loud. They spread because they were repeated. And this, what had just occurred, would be repeated. But not by her. She would not contribute to it. Because the truth, as her mother had taught her, did not require immediate defense. It required preservation. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried. Natalie did not turn immediately. She recognized the rhythm. Michael Davenport stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly. Natalie turned then. "Mr. Davenport." His expression was composed, but not indifferent. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. It was a standard phrase, but from him it carried weight, because it was not extended automatically. "Thank you," Natalie replied. A brief pause followed, not uncomfortable, intentional. Michael glanced briefly toward the direction of the main hall, then back to her. "I understand this may not be the appropriate time," he began, "but given certain circumstances, I wanted to confirm that you received my message." "I did," Natalie said. "And you're available to meet, yes?" Her answer was immediate, not rushed, but certain. Michael nodded once. "Tomorrow afternoon," he suggested. "My office will be prepared. That works." Another pause. Michael studied her for a moment, not intrusively, but carefully. "You handled yourself well," he said. It was not praise. It was observation. Natalie met his gaze evenly. "There was nothing to handle," she replied. Michael did not challenge that, because in a sense, she was correct. What had occurred did not require reaction, it required memory. "And Mr. Whitmore?" he asked, his tone neutral. Natalie's expression did not change. "He left," she said. No elaboration, no speculation, just fact. Michael inclined his head slightly. "I see." He did not ask where Luke had gone. He did not ask why. Because those questions at this stage were irrelevant. What mattered was what came next. "I'll have my assistant send you the details," he said. "Thank you." Michael hesitated just briefly, then added, "Until we meet, I would advise discretion." Natalie understood. Of course. He gave a small nod, then stepped back, allowing the conversation to end without prolonging it. Natalie watched him go, not out of curiosity, but acknowledgement. He, like her mother, operated with intention. That meant something. When she returned to the main hall, the crowd had thinned. The cathedral, once filled, now felt larger, its silence more expansive, less contained. A few remaining guests offered final nods as they passed. No one mentioned Luke directly, but his absence remained present. Natalie moved through the space one last time, her gaze steady, her steps unhurried. At the front, she paused briefly beside the coffin. Not to say goodbye. That had already been done. But to recognize the moment, because everything that followed would be built from this point forward. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She simply stood, then turned, and walked toward the exit. Outside, the air was cooler. The city moved as it always did. Cars passing, people walking, life continuing without acknowledgement of what had occurred inside. Natalie stepped onto the sidewalk, alone. For the first time in years, the absence beside her did not feel like something missing. It felt like something revealed. She glanced once down the street, not searching, not expecting, but noting. Luke was nowhere in sight. Of course he wasn't. Natalie adjusted her coat slightly, then began to walk. Not quickly, not aimlessly, but with a direction she did not need to announce. Because for the first time, she was no longer following a structure someone else had built. She was stepping into one that had been waiting for her all along. And she intended to understand it. Completely. The house was quiet in a way that did not feel temporary, not the kind of quiet that follows a long day or even a difficult one, but something more settled, more permanent, as if the walls themselves had adjusted to the absence of voices, of movement, of expectation. Natalie Whitmore unlocked the front door just after 4 in the afternoon. She did not hesitate before entering. She had never been afraid of silence. If anything, she trusted it more than noise. The foyer greeted her, as it always had, immaculate structured, untouched by the emotional weight she carried in with her. The arrangement of furniture remained precise, the lighting soft and deliberate. Nothing had shifted, except everything had. She closed the door behind her with care, the sound muted, almost respectful. Her coat remained on for a moment longer than necessary before she removed it and placed it neatly on the rack. Luke's coat was not there. That too, she noted, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. He had not returned. She moved further into the house, her steps unhurried, her gaze steady. The living room stood exactly as they had left it the morning before, clean, composed, untouched by interruption. A glass sat on the side table near the armchair Luke preferred. Half empty, slight condensation dried along its rim. He had been there recently, before the funeral, before the decision. Natalie did not pick up the glass. She did not need to. Its presence was enough. She passed through the room and into the kitchen, where the stillness deepened. The second cup from the morning remained on the counter, exactly where she had left it. Cold, untouched. A small detail. But details Natalie understood were rarely small. She approached the counter and looked at it for a moment, her expression unchanged. Then, without ceremony, she poured the contents into the sink. The liquid disappeared quietly, leaving behind no trace except the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. She rinsed the cup, dried it, placed it back in its position. Everything returned to order, except the pattern had broken. Natalie moved to the dining room next. The long table, once the site of carefully measured conversations, of controlled interactions and polite exchanges, stood empty. The chairs remained aligned, the surface untouched. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge as she passed, not lingering, just acknowledging. Because this space, like the rest of the house, held memory. And memory, when left unexamined, had a way of shaping decisions without permission. Natalie did not intend to allow that. She turned and made her way upstairs. The bedroom door stood partially open. Inside, nothing appeared out of place. The bed was made, the curtains drawn halfway, allowing filtered light to soften the room. Luke's side of the closet remained closed. Natalie stepped inside and paused. Not because she expected to find something, but because she understood that this room represented something that had already shifted, even if its appearance had not yet caught up. She moved toward the dresser. Her phone rested in her hand. Still no messages, no missed calls. The absence had now extended beyond a few hours. It had become intentional. Natalie set the phone down and opened the top drawer. Inside, everything remained as it had been organized, deliberate. Jewelry placed carefully in compartments, watches aligned, small items categorized with quiet precision. Eleanor had always said that how a person arranged their belongings often revealed more than how they arranged their words. Natalie had taken that to heart. She closed the drawer. Then slowly she crossed the room to Luke's side of the closet. Her hand paused briefly on the handle, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Opening this would not reveal anything unexpected, but it would confirm something. She opened it. Inside his suits hung in perfect order dark tones, tailored lines, structured silhouettes. Shoes arranged below, accessories placed with care. Everything appeared intact, except there were gaps, subtle but present. 2 suits missing, a travel bag gone. Not enough to suggest urgency, but enough to indicate preparation. Natalie closed the closet, quietly. Luke had not left impulsively. He had planned this, perhaps not the exact moment, but the departure itself. And that more than anything else clarified what the morning had been. Not an emotional reaction, a decision already made. Natalie turned away from the closet and walked back toward the hallway. She did not search further. She did not open drawers or check for additional absences, because she already had what she needed: facts. And facts, once established, did not require repetition. Downstairs, the house remained unchanged. Still, structured, waiting. Natalie returned to the living room and sat by the window, the same place she had chosen that morning. The city beyond continued its steady rhythm cars, moving people passing life, unfolding without interruption. Her phone remained silent. On the table beside her, a single envelope rested. It had arrived earlier in the day, delivered without ceremony, placed precisely at the center of the table, as though it had been waiting for her. Natalie reached for it. The paper was thick, high quality, kind used by firms that value discretion as much as presentation. She recognized the name before she even opened it. Davenport & Cole, LLP, Michael Davenport's firm. She turned the envelope over once, then opened it carefully. Inside, a single letter. Concise, professional. A formal request to attend a private meeting regarding the estate of Eleanor Whitmore. Date, time, location, tomorrow. 2:00 p.m. No additional details, no explanation. Just instruction. Natalie read it once, then again. Her expression did not change, but something settled into place. Not surprise, not anticipation, alignment. Because this, whatever it was, had been set in motion long before today. Before the funeral, before Luke's departure, before even Eleanor's passing. Her mother had prepared. Of that Natalie had no doubt. The question was not what had been left behind, but why? Natalie folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Then she set it down beside her phone. 2 objects, both carrying information, one silent, one waiting. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window once more. The light had begun to shift, softening into early evening, time moving forward, as it always did. But for Natalie, the movement felt different now. Not imposed, not reactive, intentional. She reached for her notebook again, opened to the same page as before. Beneath her previous entries, she added, "No return as of 4:12 p.m. A pause. Personal belongings removed partial. Another pause. Then, after a moment's consideration, premeditated departure. She stopped writing, closed the notebook, placed it carefully on the table. There was more she could add, more she would add, but not yet, because the next piece of information would not come from observation. It would come from disclosure, and that required patience. Natalie sat in the quiet a while longer, not waiting for Luke, not expecting anything from him, but preparing for tomorrow, for whatever her mother had arranged, for whatever structure was about to be revealed. Outside, the city lights began to appear one by one. Inside, Natalie remained still, composed, and for the first time in a long time uncertain. Not in a way that unsettled her, but in a way that suggested possibility. Because uncertainty, unlike chaos, could be navigated. And Natalie Whitmore had always known how to navigate. She simply needed the full map, and tomorrow she would begin to receive it. The office of Davenport & Cole LLP occupied the upper floors of a glass and stone building overlooking Park Avenue. It did not announce itself loudly. No excessive signage. No ostentatious decor. Just quiet authority. Natalie Whitmore arrived 5 minutes early. Not out of habit, but out of preference. Time she believed should never be chased. It should be met. The lobby was minimal marble floors, muted tones, a reception desk positioned with exact symmetry. A woman in a navy suit greeted her with a polite nod. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Davenport is expecting you." Of course he was. Natalie signed in her handwriting steady, then followed the assistant toward a private elevator. No unnecessary conversation filled the space between them. The silence was not awkward. It was intentional. When the elevator doors opened, the atmosphere shifted, not in grandeur, but in precision. The corridor was quiet, the carpet soft underfoot, the lighting carefully measured to avoid harshness. Control. Every detail reflected it. Michael Davenport was waiting just outside his office. "Miss Whitmore," he said, stepping forward. "Mr. Davenport." They shook hands briefly. His grip was firm, but not performative. His gaze direct, but not invasive. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Of course." He gestured toward the office behind him. "Please." Natalie entered. The room was large, but not overwhelming. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, but the view did not dominate the space. The desk was organized with exacting care documents, aligned, no excess clutter, everything placed with purpose. It reminded her faintly of her mother. Michael closed the door behind them. Privacy established. "Would you like anything?" he asked. "Water, coffee? No, thank you." He nodded once and moved toward his desk, retrieving a folder. Thick, structured, prepared. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he took a seat and indicated the chair across from him. Natalie sat. Her posture was straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. No fidgeting, no visible anticipation. Michael observed that, noted it. Then finally he spoke. "Your mother," he began, "was a very deliberate woman." Natalie met his gaze. "Yes." Michael inclined his head slightly. "She believed in preparation, in long-term structures, in ensuring that outcomes were not left to chance." He paused, not for effect, but for clarity. "What I'm about to explain to you," he continued, "has been in place for many years. It was not created in response to recent events. It was designed well in advance." Natalie listened. Every word placed, every sentence measured. Michael opened the folder. Inside were documents, legal, financial, layered in complexity. He turned the first page toward her. "At the center of your mother's estate," he said, "is a trust." Natalie's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. "A substantial one," Michael added. "How substantial?" she asked. Her voice was calm, neutral. Michael held her gaze for a moment, then answered, "Approximately $50 billion. The number did not echo. It did not distort the room. It simply existed. Natalie did not react immediately. No widening of the eyes, no shift in posture, only a slight narrowing of focus, as though she were adjusting to the scale of what had just been presented. "I see," she said. Michael watched her carefully. Most people, upon hearing such a figure, responded instinctively. Shocked disbelief, questions driven by emotion rather than structure. Natalie did not. That mattered. "This trust," Michael continued, "is composed of diversified holdings, equities, private investments, real estate, international assets. It has been managed conservatively with long-term growth as its primary objective." He turned another page. "Your mother was the primary beneficiary during her lifetime." A pause. "And now," he said, "you are." Silence followed, not empty, but absorbing. Natalie's gaze moved briefly to the documents, then back to Michael. "What are the conditions?" she asked. Not "why me?" Not "how is this possible?" Conditions. Michael allowed the smallest hint of acknowledgement. "As I mentioned," he said, "your mother believed in structure. This trust is not unrestricted." He slid a document slightly closer to her. "You are the sole beneficiary," he continued, "but the assets are held within a protected framework. They are not subject to division in the event of marital dissolution. They cannot be accessed by external parties without authorization. And all major disbursements require oversight through this office." Natalie read the first lines. "Legal language, precise, binding. And my authority?" she asked. "You have control," Michael replied, "within the parameters defined. You may allocate funds, establish initiatives, restructure portions of the portfolio, provided they align with the trust's governing principles. And those principles, Michael's gaze remained steady. Preservation, growth, discretion. Natalie nodded once. It aligned. Of course it did. Eleanor Whitmore had never built anything without intention. And my husband, Natalie asked. The question was simple, direct. Michael did not hesitate. He is not included. The words were clear, final. No access, he added. No claim. No indirect benefit. Natalie absorbed that, not as relief, not as advantage, but as confirmation. Because if Eleanor had designed this structure years ago, then she had anticipated something, or someone. Natalie closed the document gently. What else, she asked. Michael studied her for a moment, then turned another page. There are additional provisions, he said. Contingencies, governance protocols, succession planning. We will review those in detail over time, he paused. But there is one more matter you should be aware of immediately. Natalie waited. Michael folded his hands lightly on the desk. Given the size of this trust, he said, and the protections in place, any attempt to access or influence it improperly would trigger legal safeguards. A slight shift in tone. Not warning, clarification. This includes individuals within your immediate personal circle. Natalie's gaze did not waver. You're referring to Luke, she said. Michael did not confirm. He did not need to. I'm referring to anyone, he replied, neutral, but precise. Natalie leaned back slightly in her chair, not retreating, positioning. And if such an attempt were made, she asked. Michael's expression remained unchanged. It would be documented, he said, and addressed. No elaboration, none required. Silence settled between them again. But this time it carried weight, because the structure had been revealed. And within that structure, Natalie's position had shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but fundamentally. She was no longer operating within Luke's framework. She was operating within one her mother had built, one that did not include him. Michael closed the folder. For now, he said, I recommend discretion. No immediate changes, no disclosures. Natalie nodded. That won't be a problem. I didn't expect it would be. He stood. The meeting for now was concluded. Natalie rose as well. She did not reach for the documents. Not yet. Because she understood something critical, possession was not the same as control. Control came from understanding, and understanding required time. I'll have copies prepared for you, Michael said. Secure delivery. Thank you. They moved toward the door. Michael opened it. But before she stepped out, he spoke again. Miss Whitmore. Natalie turned. Yes. Michael held her gaze for a moment. Your mother trusted you with this, he said, not because of what you might do with it. A brief pause, but because of what you wouldn't. Natalie did not respond immediately. Because she understood. Restraint, discretion, control. She gave a small nod, then stepped into the corridor. The door closed quietly behind her. As she walked toward the elevator, the city beyond the windows seemed unchanged. But Natalie knew better. Nothing had changed outside. Everything had changed within. And somewhere, without knowing it, Luke Whitmore had already lost access to something he had never even known existed. Control Natalie Whitmore had come to understand rarely announced itself. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. It operated quietly beneath the surface of daily routines disguised as efficiency, as logic as structure. And for years, she had lived inside it. Not trapped, but contained. The realization did not arrive suddenly in Michael Davenport's office. It had been forming long before that, layer by layer, moment by moment, each instance too small to justify confrontation, but too consistent to ignore entirely. Now, with the framework of her mother's trust laid clearly before her, those moments began to reorganize themselves. Patterns emerged, not new ones, just ones she could no longer afford to overlook. That evening, Natalie returned home with the same measured composure she had carried into the meeting. The city had already begun its descent into night. lights reflected off glass and steel, creating the illusion of movement, even in stillness. Inside the house, nothing had changed. Luke had still not returned. His absence had moved beyond anomaly. It had become a condition. Natalie set her bag down in the entryway and walked into the living room. The space greeted her with the same quiet neutrality it always had, unchanged, unresponsive, indifferent to the shift that had occurred. She sat, not out of fatigue, but out of intention, because what came next required clarity. And clarity, as her mother had taught her, required review. Natalie reached for her notebook, opened it. The entries from the previous day remained precise, minimal, factual. No interpretation, no emotion, just record. She turned the page, then paused, because before she could write anything new, she needed to revisit what had already been established. Her mind moved backward, not to the funeral, not to Luke's departure, but further. To earlier moments, smaller ones, the kind that rarely stood out on their own. The first time Luke had suggested consolidating their finances had been framed as practicality. "It just makes things easier," he had said, standing in the kitchen reviewing documents she hadn't fully examined yet. Less duplication, more control. At the time, Natalie had agreed. Not because she lacked understanding, but because the reasoning had been sound. Or at least, it had appeared that way. Control, after all, was not inherently negative. It depended on who held it and how it was used. In the beginning, Luke had been transparent. He explained investments, walked her through decisions, presented options. But gradually, subtly, that changed. Explanations became summaries. Summaries became conclusions. And conclusions became statements. "This is the best move. I've already taken care of it. You don't need to worry about that." Natalie had noticed. Of course she had. But she had also recognized something else. Luke did not respond well to resistance. Not overtly. He did not argue in explosive ways. He did not raise his voice without cause. But he dismissed, efficiently. If she questioned a decision, he would respond with just enough information to close the discussion, not enough to open it. If she pressed further, his tone would shift, not aggressive, but conclusive. "You're overcomplicating this." And eventually, she stopped pressing. Not because she agreed, but because she understood the outcome. The conversation would end, with or without her. That more than anything had defined the structure of their marriage. Not conflict, but control of direction. Natalie turned her attention back to the present. The house remained still. Her phone rested on the table beside her. No new messages. She reached for it anyway. Not expecting anything, just confirming. The screen lit up. Nothing. She set it back down. Then slowly she stood and walked toward the study. The room had always been Luke's domain, not by declaration, but by use. His desk occupied the center position to face the door. Files were arranged in neat stacks. A computer sat close its surface, reflecting the dim light from the overhead fixture. Natalie paused at the threshold. Not because she felt she didn't belong, but because for years she had been made to feel that this space operated independently of her. Now, that distinction no longer applied. She stepped inside. The air carried a faint scent of leather and paper. Organized, controlled, predictable. Natalie moved to the desk and ran her fingers lightly along its surface. No dust, no disorder, everything in place. She opened the top drawer, inside folders, labeled, categorized. But something was missing, not the files themselves, but access. Most of the folders contained summaries, documents that referenced larger structures, not the structures themselves. Overviews, not originals. Natalie closed the drawer, then moved to the computer. She opened it. The screen came to life instantly, requiring a password. Of course. She did not attempt to guess it, not yet. Because guessing was not her method. Verification was. Instead, she stepped back and observed the room again. The placement of objects, the alignment of files, the absence of anything unnecessary. Luke valued efficiency. That much was clear. But efficiency, when taken too far, often required concealment, because not everything could be streamlined without leaving something out. Natalie returned to the desk. This time, she opened the second drawer. Inside, a smaller set of documents, less formal, more personal. Bank statements, partial, not comprehensive, but enough. She lifted one, examined it. The account number was unfamiliar. Not the joint account. Not any account she had previously accessed. A separate structure. Natalie did not react outwardly. She simply noted it, then placed the document back exactly where she had found it, closed the drawer, and stepped away. Because this was not the moment to act, it was the moment to confirm. She returned to the living room and picked up her notebook, opened to a new page, and began to write, "Financial structure, incomplete transparency." A pause. Separate account, unfamiliar. Another pause. Pattern consistent with controlled disclosure. She stopped, because that was enough. For now, the evidence did not need to be overwhelming. It needed to be consistent. Natalie closed the notebook and set it aside. Her gaze moved once more toward the quiet house, toward the absence that had until recently defined its balance. Luke had built a structure, carefully, deliberately, one that allowed him to operate with minimal resistance, minimal scrutiny. But he had built it on an assumption that Natalie would remain within it, that she would continue to observe without acting. That assumption no longer held, because now Natalie was no longer confined to his framework. She had her own, one far more extensive, far more protected, and far less visible. She did not need to confront him. She did not need to accuse. She did not need to disrupt. All she needed was to continue observing. And when the time came to present what had always been there, clearly, precisely, and without hesitation, the first confirmation did not come from confrontation. It came from alignment. Natalie Whitmore did not begin by searching for proof. She began by verifying patterns, because patterns, once confirmed, required less effort to expose than isolated incidents ever would. The following morning, she did not alter her routine. She woke at the same hour, prepared coffee the same way, sat by the same window overlooking the steady movement of Manhattan below. The city remained indifferent, its rhythm unchanged. Luke had still not returned. No message, no explanation. 3 days now, not absence, withdrawal. Natalie noted it without reaction, because reaction at this stage would serve no purpose. Instead, she reached for her phone and opened the banking application connected to their joint account. The interface was familiar, clean, structured, limited. Luke had set it up that way, permissions restricted, access streamlined. Natalie could view balances, recent transactions, basic summaries. Not origins, not full histories. At the time, she had accepted it. Now she examined it, carefully. Recent transactions appeared ordinary. Utilities, household expenses, scheduled payments. Nothing unusual, which in itself was notable. Because Luke had always preferred movement, investment shifts, transfers, adjustments. A static account was not his pattern. Natalie closed the application, then opened her email. Michael Davenport had followed through. A secure link awaited her along with instructions for accessing extended financial oversight related to the trust. Separate, independent, protected. Natalie did not open it immediately, because what she needed first was comparison. She stood, retrieved her notebook, and returned to the living room. The previous entries remained clear contained. She added joint account stable, uncharacteristically inactive. A pause. Then possible diversion of activity elsewhere. She closed the notebook, placed it aside, then opened the secure link. The system required verification, multi-step, precise, controlled. When access was granted, the interface that appeared was markedly different from anything Luke had ever shown her. Comprehensive, layered, transparent. Every asset within the trust was mapped, categorized, documented with a level of detail that left no room for ambiguity. Natalie did not attempt to understand it all at once. She scanned, observed, noted. because this was not where Luke's pattern would appear. His activity existed outside this structure, and that meant it had to exist somewhere else. Natalie exited the system, closed the laptop, and returned to the study. The room remained unchanged from the night before. Still, controlled, predictable. She approached the desk again. This time, she did not hesitate. The second drawer opened smoothly. The same documents, the same arrangement. Natalie removed the bank statement she had seen the night before, sat, and examined it more closely. The account was held under Luke's name, sole ownership, no joint access. The institution was reputable, discreet, but not obscure. Transactions, however, those were less ordinary. Transfers, frequent, substantial, not consistent with personal spending, not consistent with visible investments. Natalie's gaze moved line by line. Date, amount, destination. Patterns began to form. Regular intervals, similar figures. And then a name. Not a business, not an institution. A person. Vanessa Cole. The name appeared multiple times, not once, not incidentally. Repeated, structured, intentional. Natalie did not react outwardly. Her expression remained composed, unchanged. But internally, another piece aligned. She placed the statement back on the desk, not in the drawer, not yet. Because now the question was not whether something existed. It was how far it extended. Natalie reached for her phone again. This time, she opened a different application, one she had rarely used before. Email, search. She typed the name. Vanessa Cole. Results appeared, sparse but present. A few messages, short, transactional. Not intimate, not obvious, but enough. Natalie opened one. The content was minimal. A meeting confirmation, a time, a location. No explanation. But the tone, familiar. Not formal, not distant, familiar. Natalie closed the message, then opened another. A forwarded document. No subject line, just an attachment. She did not open it yet, because she understood something critical. Information once viewed could not be unseen, and timing mattered. Instead, she made a note. Email correspondence. Minimal, coded, consistent. She set the phone down, then leaned back slightly in the chair. The room remained quiet, unchanged, but the structure within it had shifted, because now the pattern was no longer abstract. It had a name, a direction, a purpose. Natalie stood and moved toward the bookshelf along the wall. Luke rarely used it, decorative mostly, but behind appearances there were often choices. She scanned the titles briefly. Finance, strategy, market analysis, expected. Then a folder, placed between two books, unlabeled. Natalie removed it, opened it. Inside printed emails. Not many, but enough. And photographs. Not explicit, not overt, but clear. Luke and a woman, Vanessa Cole. Different locations, different days. Consistent proximity. Natalie closed the folder, carefully, not abruptly, because confirmation did not require dramatics. It required acknowledgement. She returned the folder to its place, exactly as it had been. Then stepped back. The room once again appeared untouched, but Natalie now understood its contents. Completely, she returned to the living room, sat, and opened her notebook. A new page. Her handwriting remained steady, controlled. She wrote secondary account. Confirmed. A pause. Recipient Vanessa Cole. Another pause. Email coordination present. And finally, relationship personal plus financial. She stopped, closed the notebook, and placed it beside her. There was no anger, no immediate impulse to confront, because Natalie understood something her mother had always known. Truth did not need to be rushed. It needed to be complete, and completeness required patience. Outside, the city continued its steady movement. Inside, the silence remained intact. But it was no longer empty. It was filled with structure, with evidence, with clarity. Luke had not just withdrawn. He had redirected. His attention, his resources, his intentions. And he had done so under the assumption that Natalie would not see, would not question, would not act. That assumption was now incorrect. Natalie reached for her phone one last time, opened her messages. Still nothing. She set it down, not disappointed, not surprised. Because absence now was simply another form of information. And information was something she knew exactly how to use. Luke Whitmore returned on the fourth night. Not late enough to suggest hesitation, not early enough to suggest urgency. He entered the house at 8:17 p.m. Natalie noted the time without looking at a clock. She was seated in the living room, a book open in her lap, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. The lighting was soft, consistent with the rest of the house. Nothing had been rearranged. Nothing had been prepared in anticipation of his arrival. Because she had not been waiting. The sound of the door unlocking carried through the space, familiar measured. The same rhythm it had always had. Luke stepped inside. His movements were controlled, deliberate, not rushed. He placed his keys in the tray near the entrance, removed his coat, and hung it neatly. The routine had not changed. Only the context had. Natalie. He called his voice even. She closed the book gently. In here. He walked into the living room, his expression composed, his posture unchanged. There was no visible sign of discomfort, no hesitation in his step. He looked at her, not searching, assessing. "You're home," he said. It was not a question. "I am," Natalie replied. A pause settled between them. Not tense, not yet, just unfilled. Luke moved further into the room and sat across from her, maintaining a comfortable distance. He leaned back slightly, one arm resting along the back of the chair. "I had to step away for a few days," he said. "Work." The explanation was concise, pre-prepared. Natalie met his gaze. "I see. No follow-up, no inquiry." Luke watched her for a moment, as though expecting something more. A question, a reaction. When none came, he continued. "The timing wasn't ideal," he added, "but it couldn't be avoided." Natalie nodded once. "Of course." Her tone remained neutral, neither accepting nor challenging. Luke shifted slightly in his seat. It was subtle, but present, because something in the exchange had not followed the pattern he was accustomed to. Natalie was not asking, not pressing, not seeking clarification. She was allowing, and that to Luke was unfamiliar. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing just enough to suggest focus. "How are you holding up?" he asked. The question arrived late. After absence, after explanation, after distance. Natalie considered it, not for meaning, but for placement. "I'm managing," she said. Luke nodded. "Good." Another pause, longer this time. The air between them shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, because the structure of their interaction had changed. Previously, Luke directed. Natalie responded. Now, there was no direction, only observation. Luke stood, moved toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator. Routine again. Predictable. "Have you eaten?" he asked, his back partially turned to her. "Yes, a beet." "I'll make something," he said. Natalie did not respond. Because the offer was not an offer. It was a statement. Luke prepared a plate, quickly, efficient, minimal. He moved with the same precision he applied to everything else. When he returned, he sat at the dining table, not in the living room. Distance maintained. Natalie remained where she was. The separation was not discussed. It did not need to be. As Luke ate, the quiet extended. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. Because silence in their past interactions had always been transitional, something to move through, not remain within. Now, it lingered. Natalie reached for her notebook, opened it. Luke glanced up briefly. "What are you writing?" he asked. "A few things," she replied. About what she met his gaze. Observations. The word settled between them. Luke's expression did not change immediately. But something beneath it did. Observations, he repeated. "Yes." A pause. Then lightly, "You've been doing that a lot lately." It was not an accusation, but it carried weight, and Natalie closed the notebook gently, only when necessary. Luke studied her, not overtly, but carefully, because this shift was not something he had initiated. And more importantly, not something he fully understood. He set his fork down. "You didn't call," he said. Natalie tilted her head slightly. "No, most people would," he added. "Would they?" Her tone remained even. Luke leaned back in his chair. "Yes." Natalie considered that, then nodded. "I suppose they might." The conversation did not escalate. It did not resolve. It simply continued to exist. Luke stood again, carrying his plate to the sink. "I'll be in the study later," he said. "I have a few things to finish." Natalie watched him, not with suspicion, not with emotion, just attention, of course. He hesitated briefly, then added, "We should talk, at some point." Natalie did not respond immediately, because she understood something critical. The conversation he was suggesting was not about truth. It was about control, reestablishing it, reframing it. And she was no longer operating within that need. "When it's necessary," she said. Luke nodded once, as though accepting that, but not fully. He left the room, moved toward the study. The door closed behind him. Natalie remained seated, still, listening, not to the sounds beyond the door, but to the absence of them, because silence now was no longer passive. It was active, deliberate, chosen. She reached for her notebook again, opened it, and wrote, "Return day 4. A pause. Explanation, work-related, unverified. Another pause. Behavior controlled, assessing. She continued. No inquiry into personal matters, delayed concern. And finally, attempt to reestablish conversational direction. Natalie closed the notebook, placed it beside her, then leaned back slightly, her gaze moving toward the hallway where the study door remained closed. Luke believed he had returned to the same structure, the same rhythm, the same dynamic. He had not. Because while he had been gone, Natalie had not remained in place. She had shifted, quietly, precisely, and without announcement. Now they occupied the same space, but not the same position. And Luke had not yet realized that. The confirmation did not come all at once. It never did. Natalie Whitmore understood that truth when layered properly, revealed itself in sequences, each piece reinforcing the last, each detail, narrowing the margin for doubt. By the 5th morning after Luke's return, the structure was no longer incomplete. It was defined. Natalie woke before him. That, too, had become a pattern, not out of avoidance, but out of preference. The early hours belonged to her quiet, uninterrupted, free from the need to respond or adjust. She sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the stillness around her. Outside, the city had not yet reached full momentum. The streets moved slowly. The noise remained distant. Inside, everything was controlled. Natalie navigated through the secure access Michael Davenport had provided. This time, she did not scan. She focused, because now she knew what she was looking for: financial movement, cross-referencing, patterns that extended beyond isolated accounts. The trust interface offered visibility not just into its own structure, but into adjacent interactions. Not direct access to Luke's accounts, but enough data points to identify inconsistencies. And inconsistencies, when mapped correctly, became evidence. Natalie opened a separate window. Her notes, precise, structured. She began aligning dates, transfers from Luke's secondary account, email timestamps, meeting confirmations, each line placed against another. And slowly, the pattern became undeniable. Luke had not simply been moving money. He had been repositioning it, amounts that individually did not attract attention, but collectively significant, regular, directed toward Vanessa Cole. Natalie did not pause. She continued, because confirmation required more than repetition. It required intent. She opened the forwarded attachment she had previously avoided. The document loaded, a contract. Not formal in the legal sense, but structured An agreement of sorts, financial support, investment backing. Terms that suggested not a spontaneous relationship, but a sustained arrangement. Natalie read it once, then again. No emotional response surfaced, only clarity, because this was not about betrayal, not in the way most would define it. This was about calculation. Luke had built something parallel, a system outside their marriage, funded, maintained, protected, and he had done so while maintaining control within their shared structure. Natalie closed the document, then saved a copy, secure, documented. She leaned back slightly in her chair, not to rest, but to observe. Because now there was enough to understand, enough to act. But not yet, not until everything aligned completely. A sound from upstairs. Movement. Luke. Natalie closed the laptop. Not abruptly, but deliberately. She poured herself another cup of coffee, sat, waited. Luke entered the kitchen minutes later, dressed for work, his expression composed. "Morning," he said. "Good morning." He moved through his routine efficiently, coffee, brief glance at his phone, a check of his watch. Nothing out of place, nothing altered. Except everything had. "You're up early," he noted. "I had a few things to review. Work, in a sense." Luke nodded. Not pressing, not yet. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. "I have a meeting this afternoon," he said. "Might run late." Natalie met his gaze. Of course. No inquiry, no challenge. Luke watched her for a moment longer than necessary, because something in her responses remained unchanged, too unchanged, as though she had already accepted information he had not yet provided. He dismissed the thought, because it did not align with his expectations. "I'll let you know," he added. Natalie nodded. "That won't be necessary." A pause. Luke's expression shifted slightly. "What do you mean?" Natalie's tone remained even. "I don't require updates." The statement settled between them. Not confrontational, but definitive. Luke leaned back slightly, studying her. "That's new," he said. Natalie tilted her head. "Is it?" He held her gaze. "Yes." Another pause. Longer, more deliberate. Because now he was searching, not for information, but for alignment. And he was not finding it. Natalie stood, carried her cup to the sink, rinsed it, set it aside. Every movement precise, unhurried. Luke remained where he was, watching. "You've been different," he said. Natalie turned slightly. "Have I?" "Yes." She considered that, not defensively, not dismissively, then nodded once. "Possibly." Luke frowned slightly. "And that's all you're going to say?" Natalie met his gaze fully now. For now. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Because they implied something Luke had not anticipated. There would be more, just not when he chose. He stood, moved closer, not aggressively, but with intent. "If there's something you want to discuss." "There is," Natalie said, interrupting him. Her tone remained calm, controlled, but it shifted the direction of the conversation instantly. Luke stopped, waited. Natalie held his gaze. Not challenging, not emotional, just present. "I'm gathering information," she continued. The words were precise, measured. Luke's expression hardened slightly, about what Natalie did not answer immediately. "Because timing mattered." "Then our financial structure," she said. The phrase was neutral, but the implication was not. Luke exhaled slowly. "There's nothing to gather," he replied. "I've already explained everything." Natalie nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Then I'm verifying." The word landed differently, because verification implied independence. Luke's jaw tightened slightly. "You don't need to do that." Natalie's expression did not change. "I do." Silence followed. Not passive, not uncertain, but definitive, because the dynamic had shifted completely. Luke stepped back slightly, not retreating, but recalibrating. "Fine," he said, "if that's what you want." Natalie inclined her head. "It is." Another pause. Then Luke turned, picked up his coat. "I'll be late," he said again. Natalie did not respond. because repetition did not alter meaning. The door closed behind him moments later. The house returned to stillness. But it was no longer the same stillness as before, because now there was movement beneath it. Structure, direction. Natalie returned to the table, opened her laptop again, and added one more line to her notes, intent confirmed. She paused, then continued subject unaware of full exposure. Natalie closed the laptop, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened screen. Calm, unchanged, but no longer passive, because the process had moved beyond observation. It had entered preparation, and when preparation was complete, the outcome would not require force, only presentation, clear, precise, unavoidable. Action, when it came, did not arrive with noise. It arrived with documentation. Natalie Whitmore did not announce her decisions. She structured them, quietly, precisely, in a sequence that allowed no interruption once it began. By the end of the week, the evidence had moved beyond personal confirmation. It had been organized, verified, duplicated, stored in places Luke Whitmore did not know existed. Natalie sat across from Michael Davenport once again, the same office, the same measured stillness. But the tone of the meeting had shifted. The first had been disclosure. This one was execution. Michael reviewed the documents Natalie had brought with her. Not originals, never originals, but copies structured and labeled in a way that reflected not just attention, but discipline. He turned each page carefully. Bank statements, transaction logs, email records, time-stamped, correlated, consistent. He did not interrupt. He did not question prematurely, because the structure spoke for itself. When he finished, he placed the final document back on the stack and looked at her. "You've been thorough," he said. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement. Natalie met his gaze. "I wanted clarity. You have it." A brief pause. Then, and now, she asked. Michael leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. Now he said, "We proceed." He reached for a separate folder, prepared, anticipated, because this too had been expected. "Given the information you've provided," he continued, "we have grounds to take immediate protective action." Natalie listened, not for permission, for structure. "The first step," Michael said, "is financial separation." He opened the folder, revealing documents already drafted. "Your joint accounts can be restricted, not frozen entirely, that would raise unnecessary attention, but controlled. Outgoing transfers will require dual authorization." Natalie nodded once. "And his secondary account," Michael's expression remained neutral. "We cannot access it directly," he said, "but we can monitor its interaction with any shared structures. And more importantly, we can isolate your exposure." Natalie understood, because exposure was not just about money. It was about leverage and the trust she asked. "Already protected," Michael replied, "completely separate, legally insulated." A pause. "Then there is no path for him there." The statement was clear, final. Natalie did not respond immediately, because she was not considering whether to act. She was considering how, Michael continued. "The second step is formal notice." He slid another document toward her. Not a confrontation, not yet. A legal communication establishing boundaries, redefining access, documenting the shift. Natalie glanced at the paper. The language was precise, measured, irrefutable. "This will trigger a response," Michael added. "Yes," Natalie said, "it will. And you're prepared for that." Natalie looked at him, her expression unchanged. "Yes." Michael held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Good, because hesitation at this stage would not protect her. It would expose her. "The third step," he continued, "is documentation of intent." Natalie's attention sharpened slightly, meaning she asked. Michael leaned forward, his tone shifting not in volume, but in weight. "Your husband has established a pattern of undisclosed financial activity," he said. "Combined with personal involvement outside the marriage, this creates a framework that can be presented if necessary." Natalie understood immediately. Legal positioning. Not accusation, preparation. And if it becomes necessary, she asked. Michael did not hesitate. It will be addressed. Again, no elaboration. None needed. Because the process, once initiated, would follow its own structure. Natalie looked down at the documents in front of her. Not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just aligned. Because this was what her mother had prepared her for. Not the situation itself, but the response to it. Control. Through clarity, through documentation, through restraint. Natalie picked up the pen resting beside the folder. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She signed. Once, then again. Each signature deliberate. Final. Michael collected the documents, organizing them with the same precision he applied to everything else. It will be delivered this afternoon, he said. Natalie nodded. And after that, Michael met her gaze. We observe. The word settled. Familiar. Because observation had always been her strength. Now, it was strategy. Natalie stood. The meeting was complete. But the process had just begun. The notification reached Luke Whitmore at 3:42 p.m. He was in his office, mid-conversation, mid-sentence, when his phone vibrated. He glanced at it briefly. Then again, because the sender was not expected. A legal firm. He excused himself, stepped away, opened the message. The document loaded, clean, structured, precise. He read it once, then again. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Because the content did not align with his expectations. Restricted access, modified authorization, formal notice of financial separation, no accusation, no explanation, just structure, imposed, without discussion. Luke exhaled slowly. His grip tightened slightly around the phone. Because this was not Natalie, not the Natalie he knew, not the one who asked, not the one who deferred. This was something else. He called her immediately. The phone rang once, twice. Then she answered. Yes. Her voice was calm, even. Luke did not waste time. What is this? He asked. Natalie did not respond immediately. Because she understood something critical, the question was not about information. It was about control. It's documentation, she said. Luke's jaw tightened. You restricted the accounts. Yes, you didn't talk to me. A pause. Then no. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged. Because for the first time, Luke was outside the structure. Not directing, not controlling, responding. You don't get to make that decision alone, he said. Natalie's tone did not change. I already have. Another pause. Longer, more deliberate. Because now, there was no ambiguity. No negotiation. Only fact. Luke exhaled sharply. This isn't necessary. Natalie listened, then replied, It is. Her voice remained steady, unmoved. Luke's frustration surfaced not loudly, not explosively, but clearly. You're overreacting. Natalie did not correct him, because correction implied debate. And this was not a debate. This is a procedural adjustment, she said. The language was intentional, legal, detached. Luke recognized it. And that recognition unsettled him. Since when do you talk like that? He asked. Natalie paused, not for effect, but for accuracy, since it became necessary. The answer ended the question, not because it explained, but because it reframed. Luke was silent, for a moment longer. Then, we need to talk, he said. Natalie's response was immediate. We will. When soon? Not a time, not a commitment. A boundary. Luke understood that, even if he didn't accept it. The line disconnected. Back in the quiet of her home, Natalie placed her phone down gently. No visible reaction followed, because nothing unexpected had occurred, only confirmation. She reached for her notebook, opened it, and wrote, Phase initiated. A pause, then subject-response destabilized. Another pause, and finally control structure disrupted. Natalie closed the notebook, set it aside, then looked out the window. The city moved as it always did, uninterrupted. But within her, everything had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And Luke Whitmore had just begun to understand that he was no longer operating within the system he had built. The first confrontation did not arrive with raised voices or broken restraint as one might expect in a situation built on betrayal and exposure. Instead, it unfolded with a controlled intensity that felt far more consequential. Because neither Natalie Whitmore nor Luke Whitmore relied on emotional escalation to assert themselves. What existed between them now was not volatility, but a precise and irreversible shift in power, one that neither of them could ignore any longer. Luke returned home earlier than usual that evening. Not abruptly, not in visible agitation, but with a deliberateness that suggested he had made a decision during the drive back. His movements as he entered the house were familiar in form, but different in weight. He placed his keys down with slightly more force than necessary, removed his coat without the usual care, and walked directly toward the living room, where he knew Natalie would be. She was there, seated in her usual place by the window, a document open on her lap rather than a book this time. The lighting remained soft, the room unchanged, but the atmosphere had subtly transformed. It was no longer a shared domestic space defined by routine. It had become a neutral ground where two individuals now operated under entirely different assumptions. Luke did not sit immediately. Instead, he remained standing for a moment, as though assessing the distance between them, not physically, but structurally. Natalie did not look up right away. She finished reading the page in front of her, then closed the document with care and placed it on the table beside her before meeting his gaze. "We need to talk," Luke said. His tone was controlled, but it carried an undercurrent that had not been present before, something closer to urgency than authority. Natalie regarded him steadily. "Yes," she replied, "we do." There was no hesitation in her voice, and more importantly, no accommodation. She was not inviting the conversation. She was acknowledging it. Luke took a step forward and sat across from her, leaning slightly toward the edge of his chair. "What you did," he began with the accounts. "That's not something you just decide on your own." Natalie folded her hands loosely in her lap, her posture composed and unchanged. "It already has been decided," she said, formally. "That's exactly the problem," Luke replied, his jaw tightening. "You're making legal moves without even discussing them with me first." Natalie tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet correction. "This is not a discussion-based situation anymore," she said. "It's a structural one." The phrasing landed differently than anything she had said to him before. Luke recognized that immediately, even if he did not fully understand its origin. He exhaled slowly, trying to recalibrate his approach. "Since when do we operate like this?" he asked, his tone shifting towards something more measured, almost persuasive. "Natalie, we've always handled things together." Natalie did not respond right away. She allowed the statement to exist for a moment, not because she was considering it, but because she was evaluating its accuracy. Then she spoke. "We haven't," she said. Luke frowned slightly. "That's not true." "It is," Natalie replied, her voice still calm, but now more precise. "We've operated within a system you defined, and I allowed it because it appeared functional. That's not the same as shared control." The distinction settled between them with quiet finality. Luke leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he processed the implication. "You're rewriting the situation," he said. "No," Natalie answered. "I'm clarifying it." The conversation did not escalate in volume, but the tension within it deepened, because every statement Natalie made was anchored in something Luke could not easily dismiss. There was no emotional leverage for him to counter, no visible reaction he could undermine or redirect. She was not engaging with him on the level he was accustomed to. Luke shifted again, this time standing and beginning to pace slowly across the room. It was not a loss of control, but it suggested movement, an attempt to regain footing in a conversation that no longer followed his direction. "Let's be clear about something," he said, stopping near the edge of the room and turning back toward her. "You don't get to isolate me from our finances based on..." "What exactly?" Suspicion. Natalie's gaze remained steady. "Not suspicion," she said. Verification. Luke let out a short, controlled breath. Verification of what Natalie reached for the document she had placed beside her earlier. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she held it lightly in her hand, as though the act of presenting it required no urgency. "Your secondary account," she said. "The one not disclosed within our joint financial structure." Luke's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Because the word undisclosed carried weight. "I have personal accounts," he replied. "That's not unusual." "No," Natalie agreed. "It isn't." She opened the document then, turning it slightly so that he could see, though she did not hand it to him. "What is less typical," she continued, "is the pattern of transfers associated with that account." Luke did not move closer. He did not need to, because he already knew what she was referring to. "You went through my records," he said. Natalie met his gaze without hesitation. "I reviewed accessible data," she replied. "And I correlated it." The phrasing, again deliberate, structured, left little room for reinterpretation. "That's an invasion of privacy," Luke said, though his tone lacked the certainty it might have carried before. "It's a response to incomplete disclosure," Natalie answered. The distinction was subtle, but it shifted the entire framework of the accusation. Luke's silence brief, as it was indicated that he understood that. "And the name," Natalie added, turning a page within the document. "Vanessa Cole." This time Luke did react, if only slightly. His shoulders tightened and his gaze shifted for a fraction of a second before returning to hers. "That's none of your concern," he said. Natalie closed the document again, placing it back on the table with the same care she applied to everything else. "It is," she said, "when financial resources are involved." Luke stepped forward now, his composure still intact but strained. "You're drawing conclusions without context." Natalie regarded him evenly. "Then provide context." The invitation was simple, direct, and entirely within his control to accept. Luke did not respond immediately, because any explanation he offered would require him to acknowledge the structure she had already outlined. "That's not how this works," he said finally. Natalie's expression did not change. "It is now." The words were quiet, but definitive. For the first time in the conversation, Luke had no immediate counter. Not because he lacked intelligence or strategy, but because the framework itself had shifted beyond his influence. Natalie was no longer reacting. She was presenting. And presentation, unlike argument, did not require agreement to remain valid. Luke stepped back again, running a hand briefly along his jaw as he recalibrated once more. "You're making this into something it doesn't need to be," he said. Natalie rose slowly from her seat, not to confront him physically, but to equalize the space between them. "It already is what it is," she said. Her voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now that had not been present before. Not because it was new, but because it was no longer concealed. "This conversation," she continued, "is not about interpretation. It's about structure, documentation, and next steps." Luke watched her closely. Because this version of Natalie was not one he had accounted for. "And what exactly are those next steps?" he asked. Natalie held his gaze. "You'll receive formal documentation," she said. "Everything will be outlined there." Luke's expression hardened slightly. "So that's it. You're handling this through lawyers now?" Natalie did not look away. "Yes." The answer was simple, final. And in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted completely, not through force, not through escalation, but through clarity that could no longer be redirected. Luke understood then, even if he did not accept it, that whatever control he had previously maintained over the structure of their marriage had been removed, not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. Natalie turned slightly, stepping back toward the table where her documents remained. The conversation for her was complete, not because everything had been said, but because everything that mattered had already been established. And Luke, for the first time, was no longer the one defining how it would continue. The room did not resemble a courtroom. It was quieter than that, more controlled, designed not for spectacle but for resolution. The mediation suite occupied an upper floor of a private legal building in Midtown Neutral, in tone deliberate in layout, every element constructed to reduce emotional escalation while preserving procedural clarity. There were no raised benches, no public seating, no visible audience. Only a long table, evenly spaced chairs, and a set of documents arranged with careful precision at each position. Natalie Whitmore arrived exactly on time. She wore black, not as a continuation of mourning, but as a choice, simple, structured, free of distraction. Her expression was composed, her posture aligned with the quiet authority she had settled into over the past week. Michael Davenport stood as she entered, offering a brief nod rather than a greeting that might disrupt the tone of the room. "Everything is prepared," he said. Natalie acknowledged him with a slight inclination of her head before taking her seat. Across the table, Luke Whitmore arrived moments later, accompanied by his attorney Richard Lawson, a man known for his ability to deconstruct arguments with precision and reassemble them into something more favorable for his clients. Richard's presence was not surprising. It confirmed that Luke understood the seriousness of the situation, even if he did not yet fully grasp its scope. Luke's eyes moved immediately to Natalie, not with anger, not even with frustration, but with something more contained in an attempt to read what had already been decided. Natalie did not return the effort. She simply observed. The mediator, a woman named Helen Strauss, entered shortly after carrying a thin folder and a tone that suggested both experience and restraint. "We're here to establish clarity," she said once everyone was seated. "Not to revisit personal grievances. The focus is legal structure, financial positioning, and resolution." Her voice was steady, unembellished. No room for interpretation. Michael placed a folder in front of Natalie, then another before the mediator. Across the table, Richard Lawson did the same for Luke. Documents aligned. Process initiated. Richard was the first to speak. "My client," he began, his tone measured, but assertive, "has received notice of unilateral financial restrictions placed on joint accounts without prior discussion. We're here to address the basis for that action and to determine whether it is justified." The phrasing was strategic, neutral on the surface, but positioned to challenge. Michael did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened his own folder, selecting a document and placing it carefully in front of the mediator. "The basis," he said, "is documented." Helen Strauss glanced down at the page, scanning it briefly before nodding once. "Proceed," she said. Michael turned another document toward the center of the table. "Over the past several months," he continued, "Mr. Whitmore has engaged in a pattern of undisclosed financial activity involving a secondary account not previously disclosed within the marital financial structure." Luke remained still, not interrupting, but not disengaged. Richard leaned forward slightly. "Personal accounts are not uncommon," he said. "That alone does not justify restriction," agreed Michael replied, "which is why the account itself is not the issue." He paused, then continued. "The pattern of transfers is." He slid a series of documents across the table, bank records, time-stamped, correlated, aligned with clear markers that required no explanation beyond their presentation. Helen reviewed them first, then passed them toward Richard. Luke's gaze followed. Focused, controlled, but tightening. These transfers, Michael said, occur at regular intervals with consistent amounts directed toward an individual identified as Vanessa Cole. The name entered the room without emphasis, but its impact was immediate. Richard's expression shifted slightly as he reviewed the pages. Luke did not look away from the documents, because he did not need to confirm their accuracy. He already knew. Financial support arrangements. Richard began adjusting his tone, or not inherently. Michael did not interrupt. He simply placed another document on the table. An email, printed, time-stamped, attached to it a contract. Not formal in the strictest legal sense, but structured, defined. Helen reached for it, read, then set it down slowly. The room remained silent for a moment. Not empty, but absorbing. Because the sequence of information had been constructed carefully, not to overwhelm, but to eliminate ambiguity. Natalie had not spoken yet. She did not need to. Her role was not to argue. It was to confirm. Helen looked up. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone even, "do you dispute the accuracy of these documents?" Luke leaned back slightly in his chair. Not defensive, not evasive, but calculating. "No," he said. The answer was direct. Because denial would not serve him here, not with documentation this precise. Helen nodded once. "Then we move forward with established facts." She turned her attention back to the table. Michael continued. "In addition to the financial transfers, there's documented correspondence indicating coordination of these transactions in conjunction with personal meetings." He did not elaborate. He did not assign interpretation, because the documents themselves did that. Richard closed the folder in front of him. Carefully, deliberately. "This is a private matter," he said. "While it may be relevant in a broader context, it does not automatically justify unilateral financial control." Michael inclined his head slightly. "Ordinarily, that would be correct," he said. "However, in this case, the existence of undisclosed financial structures combined with redirection of shared resources creates grounds for protective action." He paused, then added, "particularly when those resources intersect with larger financial frameworks." Richard's gaze sharpened slightly. "What larger frameworks?" he asked. Michael did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked briefly at Natalie, not for permission, but for acknowledgement. She gave a slight nod. That was enough. Michael returned his attention to the table. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "is the sole beneficiary of a protected trust established prior to the marriage valued at approximately $50 billion. The number did not echo, but it shifted the room, not through volume, but through implication. Richard's posture changed subtly but noticeably. Helen Strauss remained composed, though her attention sharpened. Luke did not move at all. For a moment, the information did not fully register. Not because he lacked understanding, but because it had never been part of the structure he believed he controlled. "Repeat that," Richard said. Michael did, calmly, precisely. No variation, no adjustment. When the words settled a second time, the silence that followed carried a different weight, because now the context had changed. Completely. Natalie spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, unhurried. "This trust," she said, "is entirely separate from our marital assets. It is protected, structured, and inaccessible without authorization." She looked directly at Luke. Not with accusation, not with emotion, but with clarity. "You were never included in it." The statement did not need emphasis. It carried its own. Luke's expression remained controlled. But something beneath it shifted, because for the first time, he was not just responding to exposure. He was confronting absence, an entire structure existing beyond his reach, beyond his awareness, beyond his control. Helen Strauss closed her folder. Given the information presented, she said the financial restrictions appeared justified as a protective measure. Her tone remained neutral, but the conclusion was clear. "We will proceed accordingly." Luke said nothing, not immediately, because whatever response he might have prepared no longer applied. Across the table, Natalie remained composed, unchanged, not victorious, not reactive, simply resolved. And in that room, without raised voices or dramatic declaration, the balance between them shifted fully, not through confrontation, but through the undeniable weight of documented truth. The outcome was not announced with ceremony. There was no formal declaration, no moment designed for recognition or reaction. Instead, the conclusion emerged through documentation structured, precise, and quietly final, in a way that left no room for reinterpretation. By the end of the mediation process, the terms had been established, reviewed, and recorded. The legal framework that once connected Natalie and Luke Whitmore through shared financial control had been formally dismantled and replaced with something far more defined: separation. Not just in the emotional sense, which had already occurred long before either of them acknowledged it, but in the structural sense that governed everything beneath the surface assets authority access. Natalie reviewed the final documents in Michael Davenport's office later that afternoon. The same room, the same stillness, but a different phase. Michael sat across from her. His posture composed, his attention focused on the pages between them. The agreement reflects the terms established during mediation, he said. All shared financial accounts have been restructured. Your exposure is fully contained. Your independent assets remain protected. Natalie read each section carefully, not skimming, not assuming, because understanding to her was not a formality. It was a requirement. The trust remains entirely separate. Michael continued. There are no provisions that allow for indirect access and no obligations tied to marital status. Natalie nodded slightly, her gaze still on the document. And his position, she asked. Michael did not hesitate. Limited, he said. He retains control over his personal accounts, but no longer has any authority within shared structures. Additionally, any attempt to challenge the arrangement would require him to address the documentation presented during mediation. Natalie closed the file gently. Which he won't, she said. It was not a prediction. It was an assessment. Michael regarded her for a moment. No, he agreed. He won't. Because Luke Whitmore understood risk, and the documentation left no ambiguity. Natalie stood. The meeting had reached its natural conclusion. There is one more item, Michael added. She paused. He reached for a smaller document and placed it on the desk. A formal dissolution filing, he said. Prepared, but not submitted. That decision remains yours. Natalie looked at it, not with hesitation, but with consideration. Because this, unlike the previous steps, was not purely structural. It was final. She did not pick it up, not yet. I'll review it, she said. Michael nodded. There's no urgency, he replied. The current structure is stable. Natalie inclined her head slightly. Thank you. She turned and walked toward the door. Her movements measured her posture unchanged. Behind her, the office remained, as it always had, controlled, precise, unaffected by the outcome it had just facilitated. Luke Whitmore did not contact her that evening, or the next, or the one after that. His absence, once a disruption, had now become a form of distance that no longer required explanation. Natalie did not reach out, because there was nothing left to clarify. Their interactions, when necessary, moved through formal channels, brief, contained, entirely devoid of personal language. Communication existed only where it was required, and even then it remained minimal. Luke's world, once structured around controlled expansion, had begun to contract. Not visibly, not publicly, but internally. His professional standing remained intact for now, but the quiet erosion of reputation had already begun. In environments where discretion was valued, patterns like his did not go unnoticed forever, and once noticed, they were not easily dismissed. Natalie, however, did not follow that process. She did not track his movements, did not monitor his decline, because her focus had shifted entirely, away from him, towards something else. The house felt different now. Not empty, not lacking, but redefined. Natalie moved through it with the same quiet precision she always had, but without the subtle adjustments that had once shaped her presence. There was no longer a need to anticipate someone else's schedule, someone else's preferences, someone else's reactions. The structure had simplified, not reduced, clarified. One afternoon, a week after the mediation, she stood in the study, the same room that had once belonged in function, if not in name, to Luke. The desk remained, the shelves, the arrangement. But the meaning had changed. Natalie approached the desk and opened the drawers, this time not to observe, but to decide. She removed the remaining documents that belonged to him carefully, methodically, and placed them into a box she had prepared earlier. No urgency, no emotion, just completion. When she finished, the desk was empty, neutral, available. She closed the drawer and stepped back. The room, once defined by controls she had not exercised, now stood as something else entirely, not reclaimed, but reassigned. Natalie did not sit at the desk. She did not need to, because control for her was not about occupying space. It was about understanding it. Later that evening, she returned to the living room and sat by the window. The city beyond continued its steady rhythm unchanged by the shifts that had occurred within her life. Lights moved, traffic flowed, conversations happened in places she would never enter. Natalie watched it without distraction. Her phone rested on the table beside her. Silent, unnecessary. For a moment, her gaze moved to the folder Michael had given her earlier, the one containing the dissolution filing. It remained unopened, not avoided, simply deferred. Because endings, she understood, did not always require immediate action to be real. Some had already occurred, quietly, completely, without announcement. She reached for her notebook, opened it. The pages within carried the record of everything that had led her here, observations, confirmations, patterns turned into structure. She turned to a new page, paused, then wrote, "Process complete." A moment passed. Then she added, "No further action required immediately." Natalie closed the notebook and set it aside. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass of the window, calm, composed, unchanged in appearance, but entirely different in position. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction in outcome, only resolution. Because what had been addressed completely, and what remained was no longer tied to what had been lost. The room was quiet, the city moved, and Natalie Whitmore, without declaration or display, had already stepped fully into a life that no longer required her to justify her place within it. There was no moment that marked the beginning of Natalie Whitmore's new life. No visible threshold she crossed, no defined instant where the past separated cleanly from what followed. Instead, the transition unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly, through a series of decisions that did not demand attention, but quietly reshaped everything they touched. Weeks passed, then months. And during that time, Natalie did not announce change. She implemented it. The trust, once an abstract structure explained in a quiet office overlooking Park Avenue, became something she engaged with directly. Not in haste, and certainly not in a way that suggested ownership for its own sake, but with the same measured discipline that had defined her response to everything else. Michael Davenport remained involved, but increasingly his role shifted from explanation to collaboration. Natalie reviewed portfolios. She asked questions, not superficial ones, but precise, targeted inquiries that revealed her understanding was no longer passive. She did not attempt to control everything at once. Instead, she focused on alignment, ensuring that what had been built under her mother's guidance continued to operate within principles she recognized as essential. Preservation, growth, discretion. But she added something else. Purpose, not in the public sense. Not through visible declarations or philanthropic gestures designed for recognition, but through quiet allocation, selective, intentional. She redirected a portion of the trust toward initiatives that reflected her own values. Small organizations, underfunded program, structures that operated without visibility but created measurable impact. She did not attach her name. She did not attend events. She did not allow the work to become a narrative, because she understood something that could not be taught through instruction. Value did not require acknowledgement to exist, and power, when used correctly, did not need to be seen. The house changed slowly, not through renovation, but through removal. Natalie did not rush to redefine the space. She observed it first, allowed it to exist without imposed meaning. Then, piece by piece, she adjusted. The study became functional in a different way, not as an office of control, but as a place of review, documents, notes, structured thinking. The desk remained, but it no longer carried the weight of someone else's system. It became neutral, then useful. Luke's presence, once embedded in the rhythm of the house, faded without resistance. His belongings, already removed in part, were completed through a process that required no discussion. Arrangements were made, collections scheduled, everything handled through the same structured channels that had defined the final stages of their separation. There were no final conversations, no attempts at reconciliation, because neither of them moved in that direction. Luke Whitmore did not disappear, but he receded. His name surfaced occasionally through professional circles, through indirect references, through the quiet movement of information that always found its way into environments where reputation mattered. There were suggestions of instability, of decisions that had not aligned as expected, of partnerships that had shifted. Natalie did not verify any of it, because it was no longer relevant. What he lost was not something she needed to observe, and what she had gained was not something she needed to display. One afternoon, nearly 4 months after the mediation, Natalie returned to the cathedral, not for a service, not for an event, just to stand. The space was empty, quiet in a way that differed from the day of her mother's funeral. Then the silence had been structured, shared, weighted by expectation. Now it was open, unclaimed. She walked down the aisle. Slowly, her steps measured her attention, focused not on memory, but on presence. The place where she had stood before, beside the coffin, beneath the gaze of those who had witnessed Luke's departure, remained unchanged. But its meaning had shifted. Natalie stopped there, not out of obligation, but recognition. Because that moment, once defined by absence, had become something else entirely. It had been the point at which everything realigned. Not visibly, not immediately, but fundamentally. She did not replay what had happened. She did not revisit the words, the movement, the silence that followed. Because none of it required reinterpretation. It had already revealed exactly what it was. And what came after had been built from that clarity. Natalie stood there for a long moment, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. Then she turned and walked back down the aisle. Not away from something, but forward. Later that evening, she returned home. The city outside carried its usual rhythm, unchanged, continuous, indifferent to individual narratives. Inside, the house remained quiet, not empty, not waiting, just complete. Natalie placed her bag down and moved through the space with the same deliberate calm that had become her constant. In the living room, she paused briefly by the window. Her reflection appeared faintly against the backdrop of the city lights, unaltered in form, but no longer defined by anything beyond her own position. She reached for her notebook, the same one she'd used from the beginning. The pages now filled with records that had moved from observation to resolution. She opened to the final page. There was no urgency. No need to summarize everything that had occurred, because the process had never been about volume. It had been about accuracy. Natalie held the pen for a moment, then wrote no further entries required. She closed the notebook, set it down, and for the first time since she had begun documenting, she did not feel the need to continue, because there was nothing left to track, nothing left to verify, nothing left to prove. The structure had been understood. The decisions had been made, and the outcome had already taken its place. Natalie turned off the light. The room dimmed. The city remained. And in the quiet that followed, there was no sense of conclusion. Only continuity, unspoken, unforced, entirely her own. The story never demanded a moment of triumph. It did not build toward a dramatic reversal or a public reckoning, because the kind of justice that unfolded here did not depend on spectacle. It moved through quieter channels, through clarity, through restraint, through the willingness to observe long enough to understand before choosing when to act. Natalie Whitmore never raised her voice. She never needed to. What she did instead was far more enduring. She paid attention. She documented what others overlooked. And when the time came, she did not argue, she presented. There is a difference between reacting and responding, between being heard and being understood. Natalie chose the latter, even when it required patience, even when it meant allowing the truth to reveal itself slowly, rather than forcing it into the light. And in doing so, she changed the balance, without ever appearing to fight for it. Luke's choices spoke for themselves. His absence, his decisions, His assumptions, none of them required Natalie to expose them loudly. They carried their own weight, and when placed in the right structure, they settled exactly where they belonged. That is what made the outcome inevitable. Not power, not wealth, but clarity. The kind that does not need approval. The kind that does not depend on recognition. If you've stayed with this story until the end, perhaps you understand that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly observing, waiting, and when it moves, it does so with precision that cannot be undone. If that resonates with you, you're welcome to leave a like. If you've ever seen silence misunderstood as weakness, share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this, where dignity speaks louder than noise, matter to you, you may choose to subscribe. No pressure, just an open door.